Hello, good morning. Welcome to our Signing Science interview series. This is fourth of 4 in the series, and today we are thrilled and want to welcome this amazing interviewer and person who is being interviewed, both Dr. Bob Hoffmeister and the person interviewing, Dr. Ben Behan. Bob is now retired from his university, so he is considered a professor emeritus from Boston University. He spent many, many years doing outstanding research in the field of deaf education. Today, Dr. Ben Behan will be interviewing Bob about his experience being a leader in the field. So we're hoping to really learn from Bob's experience as well as from Ben's in what it takes and what leadership means in a deaf-centric arena. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Bob and Dr. Ben.
Bob, hello.
Hi there. My name is Bob, and I have just recently retired from BU. I was there for 35 years. I'm very excited to be a part of this. It was an adventure, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes, we're in a technical world now. We all need to figure that out. Bob, let's start with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you become interested in the science field? What were your influences? How did you start?
Sure thing. Way a long time ago, in another lifetime, I was an undergrad student in the University of Connecticut, and I took a course with I would say, it was a course really that was called Thinking, and the professor themselves had on a white robe and was
In class?
yes.
Wow, they showed up in a robe. That's interesting.
And that particular professor invited Cheney to come as a guest speaker.
Noam Chomsky.
Noam Chomsky, thank you. And at the time, there was one thing that Chomsky said that really stuck with me and stuck with my brain, just was really impressed upon me. All children have the capacity and the cognitive ability to learn language. All, not some, but all. So that really hit me and stuck with me. So when I heard that, I thought to myself, at that time, I was in an engineering field, and I switched to psychology after that. While I was in psychology, I met a lot of wonderful people. So what happened was I ran out of money and the School of Education contacted me and wanted me to set up a program for deaf people. It was right next to the School for the Deaf. So I accepted that. And from that point on, I really got involved with the CODA DA. So in the university in Arizona.
So that means you moved to Arizona.
I did. Yep. So that experience was awful. I couldn't believe it.
Why was that? Why was it awful?
It was my first class was called Psychology of the Deaf. I was like, okay, fine. But at that time, I had gotten a book and I opened it up. It was one of the first paragraphs, and it said that deaf children are feeble-minded and unable to learn. And I was shocked.
Why did that shock you? I mean, That means, did they add that? I want to add an important point that your parents are deaf.
Oh yeah, yes. I grew up in a deaf school, correct, and my parents were deaf. I met tons of deaf people in my life, and I would tell you that they were not in any way feeble-minded. They were very intelligent. And so that was perplexing to me why this individual said that. So what I did was I might have been somewhat confrontational in the past, but in that situation, I had to. I raised my hand and I said, this is incorrect. This information is wrong. And I started arguing with the teacher. So then more and more, there were just too many things to really even mention, but that was just within the first month at that time. The university people decided that I needed to see a psychiatrist. All right, sure, fine, whatever. I said, sure, I'll go see a psychiatrist. And I explained to them, look, they think that deaf people are dumb or in some way mentally retarded. And I said, no, that is incorrect. And the funny thing is, I wrote a letter and submitted it and explained myself. And I said, I think that I make logical sense in a logical plan. I don't understand how you're making this decision and conclusion that in some way deaf people are mentally inferior. And the psychiatrist supported me. And that after that was the beginning of a long, that was a difficult, oppressive area in Arizona in that particular school.
So you decided that you needed to go for your PhD to change that kind of.
Well, yeah. So at that time, correct, I had the opportunity where I met Don and Bob Davila, and they came to Arizona, and I went and I had met them. I told them the horrible things that I had experienced and heard, and Don invited me and offered me a scholarship to go to the University of Minnesota, and I accepted that. So I then moved from the heat to the frozen tundra. And after that, I then went to Temple University for 4 years and then ended up at Boston University. I got to BU in 1980s. 1980 basically is when I got to Boston.
Your journey. I do know the story is quite incredible. You faced many challenges, especially systematic. Then you came to BU. You became the director of the Deaf Ed program, and that gave you an opportunity to start afresh and start clean. You were able to bring your research agenda. Do you mind sharing what your current research agenda is, or what you think is important? What a research team needs to try to pursue?
So in Boston, my research agenda there was really, I wanted very much so. I started with needing to change the program from an oral-based program to a more manual-based ASL program. So that was my first order of business. The second thing I needed to do was to establish a research agenda to show that deaf kids have all of the cognitive tools necessary to think and act in a cognitive manner. And through ASL, which if they have that as their first language and English as their second language, they're completely capable. So it started with this. Before I started in deaf studies, we established working with the university. It wasn't a struggle. It was just a new experience, something I hadn't experienced. I didn't have tenure, and people told me that I needed to be careful of what I said in order to gain tenure, but yeah. So what we needed to do was to convince and encourage the university to accept deaf students and to get them to come and to be involved in Boston University. So in the second area, when I talk about ASL as a language, so these two things were a little difficult for the university to accept at first.
Can I just add a side note here? You arrived at BU, correct? It was an oral program, but you know who established that oral program at BU? That was A.G. Bell. He established it way back in the past and it stayed there until you arrived and made a huge change. So the university already had a mindset of oralism and suddenly you come in with these new ideas. So it wasn't a simple change for them, but you did work on changing that. You know, back to, you know, ASL learners being able to teach the language. Go ahead, Bob.
So what we really did struggle with the university over 25 years regarding ASL as a language. However, internally in the School of Education, it was a little bit easier and I had more support and cooperation and collaboration from the faculty. So in the very beginning, the dean, we're talking about different ideas regarding deaf studies and different metrics and instruments. So I thought maybe we should start thinking about designing a program for deaf studies. So I went to the dean and we communicated a few different things, but he didn't want a deaf studies program. He wanted an undergrad program for deaf education. And I disagreed with that. I wanted a deaf people who already had their undergrad program to then be able to come to my program afterwards in deaf education and in educating deaf children. So we told them no. I have these different metrics and measurements for children, and we can design this instrument to be able to see the different courses and programs and structures and so forth. But the problem was that we had no model. There was nothing prior to that. How could we even approach that?
So there were no others. There were no other deaf studies programs at that time. BU was the first in the US. And then later CSUN, Cal State Northridge, but BU was the world starter, I guess, or not maybe in the world, but in the US. So you guys were starting from scratch.
Right. And I think that CSUN at the time was sort of in parallel, thinking similarly.
Larry Fleischer.
At his time, of Larry's time, that was around what they were thinking similarly, but it was developed in parallel, but both of them, there was no model to work from. So we did have some of these measurements. Here, let me see here at the University of Minnesota.
At that time, we were trying to figure out what kind of courses could we have. So we looked towards, at that time, there was an African studies program that was starting. So I looked at that program and I saw that they did different kinds of courses. So we thought, okay, we would use them as a beginning model. And so we designed courses in ASL literature. And then consequently, no, let me back up just for a minute, in deaf literature first. And then after that, we looked at ASL literature. And then next, we changed some of the courses for psychology. We didn't call it psychology of the deaf. I mean, for the deaf, it was of the deaf. I thought that was important. We also started working on adding research on ASL acquisition and ASL linguistics. From that beginning, we then had an undergraduate program in deaf studies. Interestingly, yes, then we began to expand. And I guess the university wasn't worried about what we were doing. They didn't really know what was happening. So we started to advertise this program for the first year. And in the first year, we set up an ASL 1 and 2 class course, and that's it. Within those classes, we started to expand. We got about 800 students for those classes. At the same time, we advertised a deaf studies major. And in the second year, I would say that was 1982. In the second year, we had 100 undergraduate majors. So right away expanded so quickly. And the university was just shocked by that growth. But the problem was, what do we do? Who's going to teach all of this and all of these students? So that's where we started thinking, and I came up with, okay, we have to figure out what to do. So my plan at the time, I always wanted to bring in deaf students. So we started to advertise for deaf students. We got the word out to the community. We had open positions, and I did have deaf people or deaf students that would show up. So we set this up with Steve, and we figured this out where we could all work together and how to teach ASL, how to teach the other courses that we intended, how we could do that. So we started with trying to remember, I would say maybe 4 or 5 people who were teaching. I would say by year 3, we had 800 ASL students in the program.
Right.
Right, 100 undergrads. So the program just really progressed. But remember, ASL the university did not accept ASL as a language. So that was another struggle we encountered, 25 years of that. So our program, we did get a lot of support, yet the deaf students really had to function, I don't know, sort of underground, because they had that negative perspective placed on them. So there was a lot of work we had to do, a lot of pressure on the people in the program during that time.
So that really links to the next question. How did you model different ways of leadership in establishing different leadership principles to be able to lead the way to accomplish those goals? I know in general we have scientific goals, but we also have human and humanistic goals. How did you help foster young researchers, and particularly deaf and hard of hearing students, and model how to do that research and how to do ethical procedures? What was your approach, and did it work? What mistakes did you learn from along the way? So could you talk more about your way of doing research?
Let me back up. In working with the university, one thing that we had to do is encourage acceptance. The idea that deaf students can do, that they can participate, especially with grad students.
And that was in the 80s, 81, 82. So I'm thinking, like, back at that time, I remember it was, people didn't, yeah, it was an interesting time.
Yes, we had a lot of discussion around acceptance and recruiting deaf students. I mean, all deaf students. For me, I do know I have to be careful with the experience. I knew that the university would prefer oral students. And I said, okay, that's fine, but I need deaf students who actually know ASL, who are interested in researching being deaf and the problems that deaf people encounter in society, in school, and how do deaf children actually learn things. So we had to really try and plan. It had more to do with the university, I say. I mean, a lot of the work and a lot of our time, a lot of meetings were taken to convince the university. Now, fortunately for me, I had OSIP money and NIH money. So fortunately, I was supported by these grants. I was funded for the students to come into the program and work. And I was fortunate enough that at the same time, I had money that was for the university. So they started to accept us a little bit more because of these grants and that we had money, meaning the university didn't pay for all these programs or pay for these students. But another problem that arose was that deaf students needed accommodations. They needed support in the classes. They needed to have a note taker. They needed CART. They needed interpreting services. So for me, I think that was one of the biggest challenges to take care of, is how to convince the university that the money, the investment is worth it. So I had to do a lot on that road.
That was prior to the ADA as well.
Oh yes, before the ADA.
So, and you had the 504, right, that you were using?
Yeah, we did have the 504 at that time. It was quite old. So we used the ADA, but it wasn't proven yet. We could always say, hey, we have the ADA, but people weren't necessarily following it.
So just the 504, really.
But again, we had to prove its use. And we had to be careful as well, because the federal government was supporting 504. So we had to just go through a lot of processes. But I gave the university credit because they set up an Office of Student Support. We had a lot of discussions of how much it's going to cost and what that would mean. And we were fortunate that the university said, okay, they were willing to start to pay for that office. So the university itself started to support the idea. And at that time, more and more students were coming with different learning issues. They started to join the program in the university. So being deaf wasn't the only experience that the university had to then accept.
We've seen obviously you've done research and you've had research goals and a research agenda, but a lot of your time has been involved in really just fighting with the university to allow deaf people access, to have them enrolled and admitted. That took up a lot of your time, those administrative tasks and battles. So that really leads to the next question of leaders, and leadership can make a difference. So what has been your experience in inspiring deaf and hard of hearing students and believing that they can make a difference?
Okay. For setting up what we needed to do, one thing that was a must is you have to make the deaf grad students feel comfortable in their environment. So we established what I labeled is equal access, an equal access process. That was not easy for me, but it was important. It was important for the deaf students and hopefully for the deaf faculty when they're hired. As they're working together, they have an environment where everybody has access to both ASL and to English, printed English. So I wanted to set that up where people would feel equal in their setting and comfortable in that kind of a setting. For me, I think as far as inspiration from the students themselves, they were willing to work with me. And I knew it was possible to, get them in and then push them out. That was the nature in the beginning. Steve Nover and I, Steve, who I thank, we established working together and being able to work with different deaf students. My ability to approach and manage with that particular, I wanted to model that you can address and you can make things happen. It wasn't easy though, I have to admit.
And so really that was the first Deaf Studies program that was established in Boston University, and really the first to really be run by an instructing program that was a bilingual, bicultural philosophy. So that really leads to my next question. What are some examples of the inventiveness that and the creativeness that you had to include as a part of your process? Students came in, they had to learn bilingual, cultural and so forth. And then they went out to teach, and they didn't have those bilingual schools or bicultural schools. So what things were a part of the process that really helped you get started? Could you give some examples of those initiatives?
That's a good question. We became a bilingual program. We began with the idea of a basic foundation of deaf kids have both languages. They have ASL and they have English. In terms of ASL, remember at that time, it wasn't accepted in schools. ASL was not accepted. At that time, I joined with the Learning Center. It's the school in Framingham. The person that was the president at that time, Warren. Right, Warren was the president of the Learning Center. So in the first, I'd say first couple of years, I would meet with Warren. What a wonderful man. I absolutely adore him because he always encouraged new ideas. He never said no to me. He never said, you can't do that. He accepted this dual program, this bilingual program. So we started training our students in the by method. And at the same time, the Learning Center was just beginning discussing becoming a bilingual program. I remember MJ, Benvenu, right? And Betty Colonimus. They actually, they joined and started working with the Learning Center. Now, I didn't work there. I was in the part of trying to convince the teacher acceptance, grad students who were trained to use ASL as a language to be able to teach. Not speech in the classroom, but using ASL only. So Warren said, that's great, encouraged and gave permission to our students. And we began a long and fruitful relationship that continues to today with the Learning Center. The bilingual idea, it's interesting. It slowly spread. It didn't happen overnight. There are many deaf schools out there that didn't accept this method either. So it was very slow to get out into the educational system. Our program was small, and we remained small because we wanted to make sure that we had places for our students to go where they would be accepted, where this method would be accepted. So it's getting our deaf students into the deaf schools, but schools were still taking, they listened to our ideas of ASL instruction, but they didn't have full buy-in. They didn't think it would fully work or be accessible enough. So it really was a challenge. And again, I give those deaf students, those grad students credit, and also the hearing students that came as well. They all came into this and tried. I had so many phone calls of people saying, or video calls at that time. No, we didn't have video phones. We were calling through the TTY. Right, technology has changed over time. But there are many students who would call crying, literally crying. What do I do in school? What do I do here? And I would have to say, calm down, accept the job before they close the door. So, it just happened that we kept going. and we got more and more, the program expanded. We got more and more students.
So some of your initiatives involve training in addition to also developing a reading program where people started to learn and incorporate and apply that in practice. Talk about that a little bit. So it was not really something that was ingrained at that time, but we knew that we had to do something, that the schools were teaching children, hearing schools, public schools, we're sending homework home with these students. And what are students supposed to do with this in this homework? So we worked together with a team of individuals who established and set up a design narrative. And we used that narrative to help with comprehension, with reading comprehension. So then at the bottom, when they're answering questions from that, we could set up a place where, so at the time we were using videos, the videotapes were just beginning, which was important to know with the technology. And now we have the internet and all of the things, it's so much easier. But at that time it was very different. We had, videotapes. So we would have to record on tape and so forth. And you would have a hearing story and a deaf narrative. So we would make copies on cassette tapes for the kids, and we would pass them out to take home to do their homework. So then they could go home and watch it and look at it and really understand the information more in depth. At the same time, we added what we now call and we label captioning, but at the time it wasn't on the videos. They didn't have that capability, but we did add the idea of how to teach reading using English print and trying to connect that to the video. But we began with the question first, not with all of the translation of the written text. So you understand the question in English first before then using the video to watch the rest of the information and respond. So then you know what you're looking for. So that really went well. Kids really started to excel and do well with their reading comprehension. At the time, the technology, it was not quick, but it was, there were some difficulties there in getting that in place. We did have a small library of the tapes, of the cassettes, and then naturally CDs or in DVDs, that technology then came up, and that was another way to then make copies and have those digital files handed out to the kids.
Okay, I'm just, we've been talking a lot, and I didn't realize how much time we have spent in this conversation. So I'm trying to figure out, I'm going to combine some questions that I have here. Good research requires a team. How did you gather your team? What approaches did you use in developing tests, the ASL tests over the years? So how did there's several thousand students that have gone through the program. Before I move on to another question, can you answer how you set up those teams?
Okay, so again, I probably will keep repeating how lucky I was to be working with all of these deaf and hearing students who really supported the idea of working hard and doing the process and doing the work. One thing we started to establish from the beginning in the mid-1980s, we were working with money and funding where we wanted to establish a way to measure language for deaf children, not English language, but ASL. And around the end of the 80s, We started to tape and video record people. We had the opportunity now to do some things. We started to really think about developing some testing in parallel to the school achievement tests, for instance, or standardized tests where they have these metrics, they have these instruments. So both seeing children's comprehension of content as well as of language. So we began to develop this testing. We couldn't particularly call it a ASL test, so we sort of underhandedly named it something different. In the grant we received from the government, we called the grant English Language Learning in Deaf Students with peer devices and so forth. From the Rhode Island Institute and Smith College. So we began with a team of individuals, and I learned myself from the experience that I needed to have a team that was set up that was not homogenous, but that had equal participation where everyone took on an equal amount of work. It's difficult, but it's true. Hearing people who work with deaf children, they do have a bias, whether or not they are aware of it. They think sometimes that deaf students are maybe not on par. So I had to think about in a very clear way of getting that unconscious bias out there. So when we would meet, many times the hearing people would say things like, "I know sign language." And at that time, people didn't use the term ASL. They just said sign language. "I know sign language." So we established a team, and the model of the team were to have equals, where it was very important. We needed an interpreter. And I said, okay, well, we got to be careful with that because hearing people may feel insulted or offended in some way that I'm requiring to have an interpreter in the meeting when they said they know sign language. But I started with that. And I said, it doesn't matter to me if they think they're going to be offended or not. I want to make sure everybody, if people are deaf and they want to sign themselves or talk in their own native language and so forth, then people can choose to speak or sign in whatever language they want and have the interpreter there just to make sure it's all equal. So I thought that there was a very positive relationship on the team and collaboration. It was interesting, after the Learning Center in Rhode Island school, the next school that started accepting this idea and what we were doing, not completely, but beginning started to accept it, was other schools just began to take that on and started to develop the ASL AI.
What is ASL AI? What does that mean?
ASL Analysis Instrument.
Assessment instrument.
So we began to develop this tool, and now we have that ASL AI and work and use that. So finally, the goal was, we met that goal with technology. Technology finally caught up with us to be able to have computers used for this and to have a platform for ASL testing. So we worked with Jean Rees, but over the years, over time, we had more and more schools for the deaf that were accepting the idea of ASL. And we were lucky because as we were being a part of seeing this, their schools were testing, and we had, when students started, they were testing and collecting the data and had a universal, this form that was consistent across schools. So we had 5,000 deaf students who were all being measured on the same instrument. So you could see that they were taking things in. It was mostly receptively, not expressively, because that's difficult to measure. But with the team, it was really nice to finally in, let's say, the end of the 90s or 2000s, Schools for the Deaf, there was no problem. They accepted this measurement, and our deaf grad students going to their schools, observing students and working with them. And then they would bring this data back, and we found out now we have good support that ASL knowledge, it's better to know ASL and have that foundation before learning a secondary language. And the secondary language is English, and building that on the strong foundation of ASL. I think the schools were surprised to find that information out with the data that we had collected. So I hope that grad students and deaf and hearing who were working together were able to influence how people were thinking about ASL as a language. Not just ASL as, I just want to learn to sign, but what does that actually mean in English, and what types of things are right and or wrong when it comes to the meaning of the language. So we had a lot of success with that. And I have to go back, the Learning Center, without them, we couldn't have done it. They really helped us set up the organization, all of the language information. They brought the deaf students in. They did a lot of the conversational recordings and so forth. So without them, without that collaboration, we were extremely lucky to have the access to really those great deaf students who were really thinking about how to design things. So I felt incredibly, incredibly fortunate.
That's fantastic. Actually, our time has run out. So, but that's quite okay. I think you've hit a lot of the points of the questions I've asked. Oh, there are maybe, let's see what I'll end with. I do know that your story does include examples of the frustrations and struggles and failures, those that have gotten up and have just kept going for the students. We've seen you pushing them those over 20 years, pushing the students, pushing people to accept the language. And even when they didn't, you still pursued. How did you model, or how did you get through this struggle? I mean, you've done that. So I want to end up with, I want to acknowledge I want you to acknowledge a couple of individuals who perhaps have contributed to your work. Who would they be? And I guess we're ready for question and answer time. We'll end up with that, and then we'll go to questions from our participants. Well, it's difficult for me to pinpoint individuals, but I do think that I want to make sure that people know that when I arrived at BU, there was Paula Menker. This is her name sign. I might have mispronounced last name. Oh, Paul. I think they always smoked a pipe in class. Oh, Harlan Lane and Donna. These people helped me get through. They taught me how to navigate a university system. And I certainly struggled with that. There were so many deaf people. I certainly can't remember all their names, but I do. Steve Nover, I want to mention, because people might not know this name sign. Oh, I'm sorry. That name sign is for Steve Nover. Yeah, I'm so familiar with them. That's why I use the name sign. Oh, I want to thank you too. I mean, I've learned so much from Ben. He was one of the smartest deaf people. He is one of the smartest deaf people. He is one of the smartest persons I've ever known. I really enjoy my conversations with Ben. And some other names, I want to, Marie Phillips, who was always reminding me about ASL. I couldn't sleep sometimes because I see her in my mind, always on me, reminding me. I'd like to thank also all of the students who have worked with me through the years and who continue to work. I do work with some of former students now. We're designing our research paper right now. So I want to thank everyone. And Ben, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, it's really hard to summarize your life's work in 30 minutes. That's a lot. You have a lot to touch on. At one point, you need to really sit down and talk about that in depth and get to all of it. First question is from Bacillus Corbetus.
Oh, I forgot about Bacillus.
Yes, we used to know them from Greece, actually. So if you had to advise someone now, knowing what you do based on all of your experiences, what advice would you give to a leader of a school for deaf children? You've been now through it. Can you take a look back from a distance and say, here's some information that would be helpful to future leaders so they don't have to go through the same battles you went through? Do you have any advice on that?
First, I think that we need to work and train and cooperate with deaf people. We need to, and if you're talking about working with deaf children, we need to get experienced people, not from a hearing perspective. We need to get the real, true deaf experience. So if I was running a school or if I was working now, I would definitely make sure that I'm working on a team of deaf people. I would start with that. And secondly, I would tell people, don't give up. I mean, the problem really is, that's a problem. I see people, they are rejected. Their ideas are turned down, but you cannot give up. It took me 15 years to get my very first grant, research grant, to study ASL as a language. And I tell you, every year I was turned down, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, but I just kept pushing. I guess my real advice would be keep moving and don't feel deflated. Just keep pushing your ideas out there.
Excellent. I'm going to read the next question.
Hello, Silly, good to see you. I can't see you, but hello out there.
Another question from an anonymous attendee says, are your methods continually running at BU? And if so, who is in charge of the ASL program, Deaf Studies at BU now? You established it and then retired. So what is happening at this point?
I am proud to say that the program is ongoing. And with a new team of people, there are more deaf faculty involved. The program leadership, the leader's name is Amy Limber. I'm sorry, I missed the last name. And Naomi I'm not sure if Cassidy, I'm not sure if I'm spelling the last name right. Also Andrew Botters and Emily. Well, anyway, there are more deaf faculty in the program now. So the program is continuing. If people are interested, you need to contact BU, talk with them, figure out how you can, get your grad degree. I would get information about, you receive information about working with deaf children.
The next question is from Dee Dee Schleihofer. Sorry if I didn't get your last name, but hi, Dee Dee, from a couple different universities. We know Dee Dee. It says, hi, good to see you on the webinar. As we're aware, our culture is constantly evolving as a result of technology, accessibility, and bilingual education. So how would you promote cultural competence in research and teaching in today's society?
Oh, wow.
Very complex question, Dee Dee.
Very complex. I think, the word technology actually frightens me. I, I'm an old man. So technology has changed so much in my lifetime and it's everywhere.
I think honestly, we started with technology with the old videotapes and cassette tapes and VHS. It never scared you in the past. You've always embraced it.
Yeah, no, that's why, I could just click it, turn it on, point the camera, but now you have to know code, you have to know the language to use computers. So I find it, difficulty just turning my camera on and off. Anyway, I think that cultural competency in terms of that, again, one thing that perhaps is a problem that I see is we don't have enough trained deaf people who can come into schools, who can come in and sit down and talk about it. Not only talk about their experience, but what are their thoughts behind the experience? Like what we're doing right now. If we can get a group of people together that establish that group, get together with hearing people who, I use the word, who are allies, I guess, who understand the basics and have a conversation where everyone is on equal footing to be able to share those ideas. That's where you can start and then expand out from there. Again, it's not an easy task, definitely not easy. But ASL research, you have to remember in the 60s with Dennis Coakley, he started it and people just frowned on him, were totally against him. But now we actually have ASL linguistics all over the world. So
And
maybe,
sign languages, right?
correct, and all the different sign languages all over the world. So right now, maybe we need to think about cultural competency and having those discussions in the same way that we did about language, is start with the groups, start writing about it, videotape yourself signing about it, and that way we can spread the word. I don't believe one person has that capacity to do that. We need many different points of view in the conversation to be able to analyze that question.
So we have Marie Coppola. Thoroughly enjoying this conversation on a cool and cloudy morning. Thank you to all who have made it happen. Bob, what do you see as the biggest challenge right now to full access to sign language for deaf children in the US and the best ways to address that challenge? So what's the biggest challenge having full access basically to sign languages for all deaf children in the US? What's the best way to approach that challenge?
Hi, Marie. Oh, another complicated question. In a nutshell, I think that for full access, we have to keep the discussion going of the importance of American Sign Language itself. And again, we have to start by bringing in deaf people into the school systems, into mainstream systems now. That's the real problem, is getting deaf people into mainstream schools. So, and then the next challenge I think would be, is how to bring in deaf people into those schools. We, myself, Todd, Jenny, all these people, and Ben as well, others, we have set up the idea of what we call ASL modeling, where we train deaf people to dual teach with another teacher. It's a co-teacher. And again, I mean, they're on equal status to co-teach any subject in ASL. So not just with teaching, excuse me, ASL, but all other subject content. I think we need that dual teaching in the classroom. It is difficult, but I think that is the next step. that we have to have more respect for ASL in the classroom, be more present in deaf children's lives. One thing that I think is interesting in terms of learning it, we all know cochlear implants now are much more accepted, but we don't realize that a child with an implant can still be bilingual. We need to start thinking that way and start convincing, people in the positions of power that, especially if they're coming from a hearing family, there's nothing wrong of having a bilingual kid.
Yeah. The next question comes from Todd Zubek. Oh, it's a sign name, Todd. Okay.
Okay, name.
Can you talk briefly about a notable experience with a successful bilingual school and or program, and what were the keys to success? If you had any experience with any successful programs, what were the key to the success of that school or program? Okay, so I think that it's possible for schools to become bilingual and to start adding bilingual methods within their programs. Doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can just start adding some things in, recognizing ASL and respecting it as a language of people. I think that it's difficult, but it's a good start. So for it to work, you really need to have and start thinking about teaching ASL as a language, and like it is a language. So many people that I've spoken to, they talk about ASL and how it works and its structure and so forth. But with kids, they can be taught, but with little children, that really they don't fully understand the idea of language. So you talk to them on their level and how English works. So there needs to be a parallel between the two languages. And secondly, I think that we have to change our way of thinking, our mindset and our view of how we think about the analysis of kids' comprehension and information, of having ASL as the foundation language one before building English on top of that. So we've seen that too many times where deaf kids know some information, but the measurement in English requires English to be able to express their knowledge. So then they get stuck even though they know the content, but if they explain it in ASL, they fully understand what the concept is. So if we start with that bilingual, you need to respect both English as well as ASL. So for me, you need to establish ASL as a first language and English as the secondary language. When that's done, you can start talking more and more. People then understand the priority of learning the sign language and visual information. Hi, everybody. I just want to say thank both of you so much for the fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time to continue, but unfortunately, we do have to end and wrap up. So I just want to express our thanks to both of you. I hope that soon we'll be able to post this link and video of the interview online with the 3 previous interviews so that we will have all 4 of the series provided for people very soon, making sure that the captions are accurate before doing that. Then we'll post and email that link out. So this was our last interview. So if you would like to see more, please email us, let us know what you're interested in, give us any of your ideas about who you would like to see interviewed. So again, thank both of you, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you to our audience and attendees for watching. Have a great day.